Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good night, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. We welcome you today to this webinar, Black Authority and the Psychodynamic Impact and Implications of COVID-19. My name is Diane Forbes Berthoud. The pronouns I use are she, her, and hers. And I'm delighted to be with my colleagues today to be having this very timely discussion. We were waiting for one of our representatives from one of our organizations to do the initial introduction, but I guess I will introduce myself and today's panelists. I see there are 96 participants online, so hello from all across the world. I'll introduce myself. I'm Diane Forbes Berthoud. I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of California, San Diego. I'm also affiliate faculty of the George Washington School of International Affairs and Leadership Studies. I'm founding faculty emeritus of the RISE San Diego Urban Leadership Program, former lead consultant at the U.S. Capitol, and lead consultant at Montgomery County Government, Maryland. I've been a faculty fellow at Georgetown University, senior fellow at the James MacGregor Burns Academy of Leadership, University of Maryland. I'm currently a member of the Washington-Baltimore Center and a past executive committee member of the Washington-Baltimore Center, affiliate of Group Relations International, and I bring to this conversation and to the conference that I directed 25 years experience as a group relations practitioner and scholar. I'm also pleased to introduce Dr. Zachary Green, Professor of Practice, Leadership Studies, Nonprofit Institute at University of San Diego. He is lead faculty of the RISE Urban Leadership Fellows Program, Associate Director of Transformation 20 IFSI in France, a fellow of the A.K. Rice Institute, associate of the Washington-Baltimore Center, and co-founder and director of Group Relations International. I'm also pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Laura Dorsey-Elson, associate professor and director of instruction at Morgan State University School of Global Journalism and Communication in Baltimore, Maryland, president of the Elson Consulting Group, Severn, Maryland, adjunct faculty at Howard Community College, almost said Howard University, Columbia, Maryland, senior fellow, James MacGregor Burns Academy of Leadership. She is a past board member and associate of the A.K. Rice Institute for the Study of Social Systems, a member of the National Communication Association, member of the National Association of Black Journalists, independent leadership coach and consultant, and she also brings 25 years of experiencing, learning from, and practicing group relations / Tavistock work, and she says, with gratitude. Finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Candice Crawford-Zakian, consultant on leadership and innovation in Human Studio, adjunct lecturer on leadership at Harvard University Graduate School of Education, leadership development consultant in executive education, INSEAD in SAID in France, assistant professor, William James College. She's also an affiliate consultant of CONU, executive coach, subculture, former postdoctoral fellow in psychodynamic research and psychological testing, Cambridge Health Alliance, Harvard Medical School. She is a member of the A.K. Rice Institute and a member of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. I'll ask each of them right now to say a few introductory remarks before we continue with the rest of the program. Zachary?
Good evening, morning, afternoon. I'm Zachary Green. I'm really delighted to see all of you here, metaphorically speaking. And the importance of this for me is that we've wanted to bring this discourse to the larger community for quite some time. And in this webinar format, unfortunately, we don't have that interactive capacity, but we want to begin to create the framing for the conversations to go forward. And we look forward to what we have to offer you.
Thank you. Laura?
Yes, good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to across on the West Coast, my first home. I also am very much looking forward to this, and I would say I've probably been looking forward to something like this for my entire career in group relations. So as a marking point, a place to create a bunch of tributaries for further dialogue around Black authority, and I'm very much looking forward to this dialogue with you out there.
Thank you. Candice.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm also very glad to be here. I am looking forward to having a collaborative conversation as these conversations percolate on beyond this webinar. I'm really hopeful and interested in looking more closely at how when Black people take up roles of authority, there's this corresponding spike in assaults on Black and brown bodies, and really trying to understand and unpack that correlation and dynamic a little bit more, especially as we start to think about what's happening now with the pandemic, reopening the country, et cetera. So I look forward to seeing where we can go with this conversation and exploration.
Thanks to all of you. So for those of you who have joined us, I'll provide for you what we've designed for today's conversation, an overview. We'll first set a context for why this conversation now. So far, my fellow panelists have talked about why. We're very interested in the disproportionate outcomes for Blacks, not only as it relates to COVID, but the justice system. And we had a recent case that we're going to be dealing with and discussing today. As director of the most recent Black Authority Conference, I'll provide for those of you who are new to group relations, as well as those of you who are veterans in this work, an overview of our task, the membership, a feel of what the conference was like, my ideas around staff structure and hiring, and we'll all talk together about our learning. And then you might be curious, how did we come to be the ones to be representing this work today in this conversation at this time? And so all of us will share with you our insights on that and what we believe we represent on behalf of the whole. Then the second part of the discussion will be around specifically the pandemic and what we believe we need to be paying closer attention to in terms of the impact and implications related to Black people. And as group relations scholars and practitioners, we're interested in psychodynamics of groups, organizations, and systems. And so we believe that's part of our key contribution in today's conversation. There will be a time for question and answer and discussion, and I'll talk about that format momentarily. So some housekeeping things and some technical aspects that I think will be helpful for all of us as we move forward. Just so you know, at this moment, all attendees have been muted. We have monitoring our chat, actually 2 former staff members, Amber Williams and Elise Cole. And we ask that you put your questions that you would like to be seen and addressed by the panelists in the Q&A box for questions. We will reserve about 30 minutes, hopefully as much as 40 if we can, for discussion and dialogue with you all. And there are multiple formats that I'll address momentarily. You may ask a question anonymously, so just put the question into our moderators and they will ask that question on your behalf. You may also ask a question, identify yourself, but still not choose to speak. You just want it to kind of text it in, if you will, in the Q&A. That will also be asked by our moderators, both Elise and Amber. If you would like to speak and engage with the panelists, which we'd be happy to do, there's a raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, or depending on how your screen is configured. That will then allow the moderators to both field your question, kind of like a producer on a TV show, to get the themes and the ideas from you. And we'll be able to unmute you and you can engage in a dialogue or conversation with us. We look forward to that. If you have any technical difficulties during the conference, this time of discussing the conference and the pandemic, please email Cynthia Fernandez at sandiego.edu. Special thanks to Cynthia and the USD team for assisting us with all that we have been doing here to prepare for this moment for you all and a larger community. So Cynthia has been our resource and will continue to be throughout this time. If there are any resources that we would like to share with you, that will be placed in the chat. Throughout the conversation, I'll cite things that we've read in the National Geographic or things in the news or something like that. Some of those may be posted in the chat. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared via email after this and posted to GRI's page and certainly USD's page and other resources. Same ways that you found out at the conference, we'll also put that there as a resource. If you have questions about the webinar, again, please ask Cynthia throughout. We will not be formally monitoring the chat, so please go in the Q&A and our moderators will help us out with that. So now for a context and overview of the events and a framework for what has shaped today's conversation. Black Authority in the post-Obama era, History, Complexity, and Identity, was co-sponsored by Group Relations International and RISE San Diego. It was a 3-day non-residential conference in the group relations tradition that provided opportunities for us to collectively explore, experience, and learn about Black Authority. A distinct feature of the conference was that in this temporary organization, the entire staff was Black. That is, all of us were of African descent. We still are, by the way. We studied and experienced together intergroup dynamics, authority relations, leadership followership dynamics, and we participated and observed and reflected on the mutual and complex relationships among identities, roles, valencies, groups, organizations, all in a Black-led context. The week after the conference ended, the US and much of the world came to a standstill because of the corona pandemic. We sheltered in place, we were quarantined. And then we later began seeing daily reports of new cases and deaths. Pretty terrifying times. Most notable for us were headlines such as Black Plague. Why are Blacks dying at a higher rate from COVID? And more that told us about the disproportionate death toll and infection rates among African Americans in this country. We began learning more about ways in which the pandemic was devastating Black communities, which laid bare the deadly legacies of inequality, inequity, discrimination, and oppression. COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated health-related, economic, physiological, and digital inequities between Black Americans, white Americans, and other groups in the US, and I dare say throughout the world. For decades, in fact, centuries, Blacks, particularly in the United States, have experienced disproportionate health outcomes and experiences, as well as disproportionate outcomes related to education, economics, access to political, community, legal, and financial resources. Part of today's discussion will involve an integration and a complication of these disproportionate impacts and outcomes and what we think about as a systemic, shadow, societal, and psychodynamic forces impacting Black life, authority, and representation. Since the planning of this presentation, an unarmed Black man jogging near his neighborhood was hunted and gunned down in Georgia by 2 armed white men. There may be discussion about how this happened, the cause, the circumstances, and the context. As Black people, observing this for perhaps the 20th time in the last decade, and as scholars and practitioners in the group relations tradition and other integrative traditions, some of us as parents and as panelists, we believe there are significant meanings and implications related to COVID-19, the disproportionate outcomes and impacts for Black people, and experiences such as the cold-blooded hunting and murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Our discussion will focus on our experience and thinking about Black Authority, the recent conference, the pandemic, and our hypotheses about the relationship between Black Authority and the psychodynamic impact and implications of COVID-19. As group relations scholars and practitioners, we believe that our work around authority, conscious and unconscious dynamics, and systems analyses could inform our understanding in these complex and unprecedented times. So how can group relations theory and practice inform our understanding of the impact of COVID-19 on Black people, our lives, and our authority? And how might we understand the state of our society, world, our government in this moment that has led to this and other related outcomes? We invite you as participants to engage with us in thinking about our collective work and the connections between the modern day events and the pandemic from psychodynamic and systems perspectives as well. So a few words about the Conference on Black Authority. In terms of the approach, I would say there was a very collective and inclusive approach to hiring, to the configuration for training, the intellectual framing. There was also an Afrocentric or uniquely Black approach. And what I mean by that is a calling on of the ancestors and a respecting of elders. So in my staffing, I consulted many of our elders in the work. I also spent some time reading the work of those who've gone on before us and those who are currently here: Dr. Leroy Wells, Faith Gabelnick, Lenise Gerard, Zachary Green, Skolnick, and others, Molenkamp and Green, etc., and including a chapter that Flora Taylor, Zachary Green, and I wrote in a Harvard Business Press Review book on Black organizations and Black leadership. And so consulting all of those pieces and getting the voices of those present and those gone before to frame our thinking on Black authority and how we might do this work. We are not the first conference to have this kind of configuration, but as I mentioned before, it was an all Black staff. And there was also an element of experimentation and exploration, creating a model that we've seen in other organizations, in community and faith-based groups, and in historically Black colleges and universities, where in many spaces, most of the staff, most of the faculty are Black. And so the experimentation is, if we create such a temporary organization, what kind of responses might we receive? What could we learn about the interlocking dynamics and the interplay of the dynamics around leadership, followership, authority, and so forth? So I'll talk about the task. To what end is this work being done? So for those who are present, and even if you are not a part of group relations work, I'll share the task with you and a little bit more background, and very shortly I'll turn it over to my colleagues. So the task of this conference was to collectively explore, experience, and learn about conscious and unconscious dynamics related to Black authority. Collectively explore, experience, and learn about conscious and unconscious dynamics related to Black authority. This is the third conference that has been held of this kind. The first was held at the American University in 1995 that Dr. Zachary Green directed. The second was also directed by Dr. Zachary Green in 2017. And then in 2020, this conference directed by me was offered in San Diego, as was the 2017 conference. For those new to group relations, conferences are typically temporary organizations where we, as I mentioned, explore and learn about, experience consciously and unconsciously, and we focus on here and now dynamics and study what's happening in the present moment to understand groups and systems more broadly and more effectively. The approach is founded not so much on teaching, although there is a component of teaching in our work, but it is on learning. And there are a number of configurations and events, such as small study groups, large study group, that facilitate that type of experiential learning into the unconscious. A few words about membership. We had 33 members and 11 staff members. So, and we lost people along the way, and we'll certainly discuss that. So there were about 44 of us initially registered and gathered to explore this work. The age group of the membership was from early 20s to close to 70 years old. The conference, as in terms of membership, had mostly peoples of color: Black, Latinx, mixed race, and Asian. The membership was half Black, and there were about a third self-identified as white. There was also a range of gender identities and expressions, sexual orientations, nationalities, cultures, people from originally born in Haiti, Malawi, the Philippines, people who are US born, people who are immigrants. And this was a fairly well-experienced membership. 2/3 had previous group relations experiences, and all others were first-timers. And 1/3 has staffing experience, including being directors, associate directors, administrators, and so forth. And most of the membership was from the West Coast, although we had maybe about 5 or 6 from the East Coast and Midwest. Finally, about staff structure and hiring. Based on the work from the previous conference, and again, consulting with colleagues in the work, what I decided to work with was a model where there was a range from junior to senior, and trying to have it more balanced along all of those lines. So I intentionally hired 2 or 3 people senior to me, 2 or 3 people at about my level of seniority, and then people who were younger in the work, and then people who were most junior in the work, meaning in the last 0 to 5 years. And so having a tiered model or a cascade model allowed for some elements of leadership succession. I also built in a consultant in training model to attend to issues of leadership succession about which we've been concerned in conferences, and specifically around Black authority and training more Blacks and peoples of color to do this work. And so to me, especially in my experience, mostly people of color train and or mentor other people of color. And in this case, that's been my experience, particularly coming from Howard University, creating experiences where that was often offered. And it's also a way to prepare new Black practitioners in this work for the rigor and the complexity of what this work requires, at least from my experience. So those are some elements that were built in and identified, I think, also from the slide earlier. You saw that Dr. Green and Dr. Dorsey-Elson were mentors in that experience. So if at some point they'd like to speak to that, that would be really great. But I really worked across institutional affiliation, entry points into the work, different traditions of the work, East Coast, West Coast, or more traditional centers, you know, people with whom you studied, et cetera, and tried to have that experience all the way across. So now that's just the overview of the conference, the structure, what I was thinking about as conference director, and how we work to make this uniquely, in our own ways, Afrocentric or Black, if you will. I'll turn it now to my colleagues to kick off a discussion about our representation, how we got here, what we represent in whole, not just for the conference, but a broader system. Zachary.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Diane, for that overview. What is important for me in this is that when this enterprise began, was when I was a native of the Washington-Baltimore Center, one of the sponsors of this webinar that we're holding right now. We were known as the Black and Gay Center. And because of that, we began to look at issues of identity and diversity in the 90s. And I was fortunate to direct the first conference ever with the name Authority and Identity in it. And before that, we had begun to look at diversity and its representation. So what's been really important to me is the sort of social justice orientation of that. And then my husband and I developed Group Relations International along with other colleagues to really begin to consciously integrate social justice and bring consciousness to unconscious work along with spirituality. More recently, what I've been looking at are the issues of generational succession. And this conference truly represented that, along with the ongoing and deeper exploration around Black authority.
Thank you, Zachary. Laura. You're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you very much. So it's interesting, and I have some ideas, and then listening to Zachary, new ideas came, and so I think I'll say that how I come to tonight, I have been thinking about my Blackness for my whole life. I have been asked to think about it mainly by Black communities my whole life. And so this is a continuation of trying to understand this construct, this construct in a way that generates learning, healing, connection. I also am a long-term and long-time faculty member at a historically Black college and university, Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, a graduate of Howard University, where I spent 6 years. And so I have a deeply rooted, vested interest in the study of Black authority because I live, breathe, and work in institutions where this is constantly up for examination in predominantly, if not all, Black systems. And much of that I brought to the conference. And so I feel as though in being asked to work in this particular space, in this webinar, I'm sort of looking for links between the work I have done at Morgan State, the work that birthed me in group relations at Howard, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes after we present where we are with the work right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I come to this work and the study of Black authority by way of rather circuitous route. Centered in Howard University. Basically, I was born and raised there. Both of my parents work there. My father started the film program there, but I was introduced to group relations through Ayanna Watkins Northern, and the Washington-Baltimore Center I consider to be my birthplace, and Kimberly Turner and Lord Dorsey-Elson to be my channels to Leroy Wells and that work and his work. And then the center, as some of you may know, was essentially defunct for some years. And I entered kind of right before that happened. So my development and my growth has happened at the Boston Center. And by way of Jim Krantz and Ed Shapiro and Danny Kennedy, and Jean Pierro's in the mix somewhere there, and INSEAD's work. So I name all of these people as a way of also naming lineages that I hold with me, that I carry with me, and perspectives that I bring to the work. And the Washington-Baltimore Center, in terms of why I even got into this and why I took up the role that I took in this conference, is that that early experience, my first residential in 2001, it really saved my life in a very fundamental way. And I would not be where I am without that exposure and that experience, because I was very much in the place of taking in a lot of the systemic projections as me, as my own, and drowning in them. So I feel a strong sense of responsibility to carry that thread of the work forward, to contribute to this continued conversation and investigation, and all of the representations and perspectives that are in me.
Thanks so much, Candice. And then as for me, I come to this work as a product of a historically Black institution as well, the Mecca, Howard University. I feel like I should do an HU call out. HU, you know, I have my Howard University pin, and I feel a lot of pride about that legacy and that tradition. I am a former student of Dr. Leroy Wells. I come to this work as a non-US born Black, as a parent, as a mother of Black children, Black son and a Black daughter, cisgender female. My scholarship and research is around Blacks leading, particularly Black women in positions of authority, from my dissertation work 25 plus years ago till now. I've continued to do that and write about that. I bring representations as well in higher education. And so that's been my primary industry, if you will, and now as a higher ed administrator at University of California. And was authorized and invited by Group Relations International to direct this conference. So those are some of the elements of my identity. I'm also a member of the Washington-Baltimore Center. I have been on and off, and more recently joined in the last few months, and was a member from the time I was a student to the time that I moved to California about 10 years ago. So that's who we are and our representations. I'm sure there's so much more, similar to what Candice said, you know, all those other elements of identity. If we went on, we would be here for all of our 2 hours, but we can't do that. So thank you for sharing that, all of you. And what I'd like to do now is for us to talk about, you know, the conference itself, and for each of us to take 2 to 3 salient observations, experiences, to give people who are listening, whether they were a part of the experience or not, a flavor of what, from your perspective, you experienced, overall themes, as well as salient and critical incidents, if you will, that shape how you think about what the conference is and what the conference means.
Well, let me start off by the issue of representation and denigration. Those are themes that are dear to my heart anyway, but they emerge very powerfully in the conference. And what we mean by that is the degree to which we represent something that is salient around an identity, and to the degree that we have a so-called Black card and how that is understood or how that's translated. And there were many, many different expressions of that throughout the conference. And at each point when those would then emerge, there would also be a corresponding projection that would then denigrate those exact elements that people were trying to explore. And we can talk about that in much more detail, because that was connected to the second theme that I'd like to talk about, is trauma, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But the way that personal trauma is activated in this exploration of Black authority. And then it's difficult to then know where we are located in that process. And the sort of epigenetic, if you will, expressions of that as a major piece of that expression. And let's talk about it in a very specific way. It's in terms of the sort of masks we wear, the sort of persona that are brought forward in the work. And this was brought alive literally by a member wearing the kind of mask that most of us are now wearing when we go out in public. It was powerfully something that could not be held by any group in the conference. And similarly, it located itself in the staff room during the institutional event. It was as if that kind of holding, that being held, could not be contained within any of us, much as we're finding out with the pandemic right now. It could not be contained within any one border, but began to be something that crossed many boundaries and now touches us all. And in the conference, it was a prescient theme that would be important for us to understand why it showed up in a Black conference and why languages of a Black plague as a metaphor for Black authority was present. There's much more, but we'll stop there for right now.
Thank you. So for me, Zachary's quite right. There's so much to reflect on from that conference, as there are in most group relations conferences. But what was so unique about this one, of course, was the configuration and the study of Black authority. And the first thing that I that I took away with, and I'm still chewing on, is a question came up quite early on in either an event or at the staff room and hearing reports about what was going on. And the question was this: it was like, can there really be Black authority without there also being a system of oppression? That these two are almost inextricably, these constructs are almost inextricably linked, was what came up. And I found that fascinating, that the idea of an authorized Black person, that authority has to come out of reacting to a systemic oppressive context. So that was one thing. If you're looking for answers, so am I. But the exploration is I suppose why we're all here. The second thing that really fascinated me, and everybody on this panel knows, I mean, I was just blown away, and it did not emerge until one of our final staff conversations, was, this construct of Black excellence. I mean, what is this? Where did it come from? And how often in the conference there was a pull. I personally, and in my roles, felt such a need to be perfect, to get it right, to never get it wrong, and to, in many ways, taking on the mask theme, to have a mask that then could be projected upon as invincible, unstoppable, and omnipotent in some ways. And this Black excellence is what we labeled it to be. And we had a very emotional owning of our complicity as a Black staff, some of us as parents, about sort of receiving this call to be excellent, but not quite liking it ourselves, but then passing it right on to our kids. And boy, that floored me. And so that was the second thing. The third thing, there's so many. The third salient piece is during the institutional event. And I was deployed to one of the sectors, the work sectors. And of course, for those of you in group relations work out there, this is, that first session right out of an institutional event opening is often chaotic. Oh, we can't prescribe experience. It's often chaotic. And so members fly out of an institutional event and are trying to organize themselves. And often consultants are deployed to the workspaces to help them with their formation process. So here I was in a room with my co-consultant, who's also working with us on the event, Amber Williams. We were in a sector, and as members began to form, the idea is as they form, they're learning about themselves, but they're also learning about what the system allows them to be in their minds in that event. And so it's fascinating, that birthing of group and the group mind. And out of the first half an hour of this first sector event, this group that I was consulting in the space to said, you know what our motto for our group should be? And instantly someone said, #effed. And I won't say it in full, but you fill in the blank. I mean, #effed, that should be their motto. And I thought, my goodness, in a conference of Black authority, to have a group feel like they were effed when given the space to create was paradoxical, and I wanted to know more. Candice?
Thanks. That's a great segue into one of the salient pieces for me, which was so linked to this Black excellence, but this idea of a monolith of Blackness, and the effort to try to maintain a united kind of, I guess, articulation of some kind of what it means to be Black, unconsciously, that it actually caused elements of fragmentation and stagnation. And some of the evidence of that was my work with the assistant administrator, Yaro Fong Olivares. We had a lot of difficulty. She specifically had a lot of difficulty because containing all of these elements of just actually holding together the memory of from one moment to the next task that we were supposed to complete, almost like the kind of Beyond's attacks on linkings, that we weren't able to hold the complexity of the experience together. And then this other element of how, despite the full authorization of the director to bring full elements of self, and all of it representing Blackness, that specifically work around sexual orientation, gender expression, LGBTQI elements, that it was difficult initially for the staff to articulate these differences, to work with them, to actually name and address them in a way that I noticed after the IE, which I think maybe the last session of the IE, where we had really rich conversations. So it kind of went from like, how do I describe, or who is considered gay, or what is the pronoun, and just all this like kind of cumbersome awkwardness around it, to really rich, full discussions of the full spectrum of multiple partners, interracial romantic relationships, and it gave way to much richer work and dialogue on staff and in the membership, as I heard it reported. The second piece that was resonant with me was really just good old-fashioned competition. So these different threads of how it's done at USD, GRI, in relationship to RISE, how it's done in Boston, how it's done elsewhere, these different ilks and theoretical frames. And then in a harder way to sort of turn and examine the implications of being competitive while Black in relationship to other Black people, especially a Black woman director who, as competent as she is, will unavoidably take significant destructive projective attacks, even from an all-Black staff. And the complexity of the heartache related to that kind of compounded vulnerability on both sides, when you know the perpetrator is in you, and you are perpetrating upon someone who looks like you, and you share those relational ties, that I think that in a way it brought up a sense or a worry that related to the earlier hypothesis that maybe differentiation could be dangerous, that we couldn't quite compete without destroying each other, but that obviously, well, it didn't turn out to be the case. Not obviously, it didn't turn out to be the case. So I think I just want to say that the last piece, like, I left with a really embodied sense of learning that since the impressor is in me, it's inside and outside, that working through those dynamics requires an incredible amount of tenacity and ability to contain in a compassionate, minimally reactive manner, all of that stuff, to move to a more powerful integration of Black identity, Black authority, and the work that we are trying to do.
Thank you, Candice. And can I say, what an amazing, brilliant staff. I totally hired y'all. I'm like, yes.
Oh,
and
wow.
This, what you're hearing from Candice, from Laura, and Zachary is a representation of the full staff, who I'll show you their pictures in a minute and name them all. This was really a gift for me to be able to work with such amazing, brilliant people and brilliant minds. So thank you so far. And I'm feeling the energy and the excitement. So I'll add to some of those themes and experiences that my colleagues and friends had. And Candice's last statement is a perfect segue into one of my first points, which is Afro/Euro frameworks, Black/white, integrations of conflicts and identities, and understanding Blackness within Blackness, Blackness within a white frame, and Blackness in collaboration with white allies and enemies. And I'll share with you a little bit some of the history, which is important here. This conference was supposed to be at Howard University, Washington, D.C. in 2019. But because of a number of political administrative struggles, that did not happen. And so it was a fallback, and it turned out to be pretty amazing. We worked our relationship through Zachary at USD, which is where the last conference was. And we both live here. So I thought, okay, I'm here in San Diego. This is the place because of timing and convenience and because of structure and support that we needed. So that worked out. And this became a question throughout, a couple questions such as, what uniquely makes this a Black conference? What is Afrocentric about what you're all doing here? These were questions that we received from the membership, and questions we asked internally as well. Why is this not, yes, at an HBCU, a historically Black institution? And so that was shared in the opening. I shared that, and it was also something that emerged in the IE plenary. There's so much more to say about that, but I think Candice covered it well about seeing or understanding whiteness in ourselves, white authority and competition, and so forth. Another major theme, and it was actually worn on somebody's t-shirt, was around fluidity. And I just also term it as fluidity, complexity, and simultaneity. There was a lot of fluidity around time, how we all as staff, as well as the membership, interpreted time, lateness. And, you know, in this work, it's like we look at that as meaning something. So people arriving 30 to 45 minutes later than the start of the first large group, for example, or not showing for one day, but coming the next day, or leaving and not returning at all. And we saw the connection there around projections that were received and worked with around gender fluidity, gender identity expression, as well as our inability to grapple with quite a bit of that when in the Black community, for the most part, we have not come to a full understanding, acceptance, or integration of those gender identities and expression, as well as sexual orientations and relationship status, if you will. And then in my own experience, and so there was a member who, I think it was the first day, sitting right beside me in the large group, or two persons down, and had this amazing t-shirt all in Black, and the white writing, the white font was, "The future is fluid." And that kicked off a lot of conversation around fluidity of boundaries in the conference. In my own experience, I felt the complexity of the embodiment of Black authority, both in my physical self. I was undressed, my clothes were changed in the conference. I had this on, no, Zachary, not like that. You know, I was in a white suit the first day, like in solidarity with women's and voting rights. And someone said, it's interesting that between, you know, the beginning of the conference to now the large group, the director has changed her clothes. And I was thinking, what on earth? What's interesting is I had a Black and white jacket, and the person said, and that I thought she was in gray at the beginning. And so I thought about Black and white and gray and the melding, and right there I experienced an integration as well as an opposition to Black authority. And of course, gray is the combination of Black and white. So I was really experiencing my physicality in the moment, and the pressures and the pleasure of holding and nurturing and providing. And the note that I put to myself here is while performing. So there was a performative element of being in a role of Black authority. And I think all our previous panelists mentioned that. And in fact, one of the statements that sticks out for me in the large group was around my role being something like a superhero. And so when Laura just mentioned omnipotence and this great power and Black excellence and some of the other elements here, I, in my body, had that experience of needing to represent that, or having to represent that, and both the pressure, the pleasure, and the tremendous responsibility of doing that, which leads me to the final thing before we move on, the paradox of Black denigration and authority. And denigration is something that Skolnick and Green has written about, and Wells had written about as well. And so it is holding a so-called denigrated identity, at least from a racial position or a societal standpoint, although occupationally, academically, professionally, and otherwise, we have privilege, at least on this call. Yet holding that denigrated identity, yet exercising authority in a complicated societal historical milieu. And so there was both the interplay between invisibility and visibility, as well as hyper visibility, particularly being the first Black woman to direct a conference of this kind with an all Black staff. So these are just some of the key elements of our experiences. It doesn't at all capture the full staff or the full membership experience or all that was in the system. But in the IE, the management team, which consisted of Zachary Green, Candice Crawford-Zakian, and Beverly Malone, and we cooked up what we think was so brilliant, but it was really, really long. So we're not going to go through it here. So that's why I'm like, well, that was interesting. So what we've done for you is to prepare a summary. Laura will have her feedback on that because she was in the staff receiving it. No. And so what we've presented here, or what we will share with you, is not the full hypothesis, which I'm sure was at least 150 words long, but some elements of that hypothesis. Zachary. You're muted. You're muted.
Damn. So what we're going to do is each of us will take a piece of this. Candice is going to start off with the disruption of the repetitive dominance pieces. Laura, you're going to do the complexity piece, right? And I'll do the shifting codes and coats. And so we'll just give you a snapshot. There's a lot more than what we're going to present, but we'll give you some clue of where those go. Okay, Candice, you're on.
Okay, great. So related to part of what I spoke about earlier in terms of gender fluidity, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, age, nationality, and non-Black representation. What are the things that qualify as fitting into Blackness, African-American versus African diaspora, old school, new school, generational splits. Again, what is the language? How do I say what your gender representation and your identity is? The movement throughout the conference from these kind of more boundaried, rigid identifications to more integration by the end of the conference.
So another aspect of the hypothesis, which really was a reflection of the state of the system at the time, was the question of this whole system was struggling with the complexity of, here you had an African-American or perceived African-American, and of course Diane is Caribbean American, but the complexity of gender, generational, and constructed identity. So we have these ideas of the unconscious about what Black is, what Black authority is, what gender is. And here the director had invited very early on, in fact, in the conference opening, to explore questions of intersectionality, questions of multiple identities. And it really created a mutedness in the system, an inability to look at that. And all of that got pushed out, things that weren't examined along those lines got pushed out into pretty hard projections and into all sorts of conference work. And this was part of the hypothesis, to get curious about that.
And similarly, what we began to notice is that there's inherently a code switching that happens among Black people. But all of us know code switching is something that when we're in one context or another, the language that we use shifts. And one of the hypotheses was about, in terms of Black authority, is then what kind of language were we using? Was it consistent with a kind of code or a kind of coat, meaning a kind of role? Everything from a sort of minstrel kind of expression to a presidential expression. All of that was available in the same moment. And the Black codes also representing something in terms of laws that were used to, before Jim Crow even came into being, of reducing the nature of what Black authority and expression could be in the world.
So another aspect of the hypothesis was the question of the ambivalence in the system to explore collective wayfinding. And this is really about the idea of the projections that often Black authority, that this has been documented in some of the group relations literature, and having a Black woman at the helm, sort of, is she nurturing or is she going to kill us? Is she going to hold us on our, is she going to give us the nurture of milk, or is she going to poison us? So this sort of this, this is really very interesting, and there's an ambivalence to sort of join with that kind of leadership and authority, and that was present in the hypothesis to understand and see how one could then work through. How could we all collectively work through these pretty denigrating and splitting projections?
So another element of the hypothesis was the perpetuation of very US-centric tropes of oppression, specifically in terms of aggression and denigration, splitting, and automatic responses. So really the way that this comes to mind for me is this kind of essentially sadomasochistic relationship in terms of race dynamics in the United States, in that it can only kind of be entered through this very aggressive, primitive narrative, and bringing up ideas of the, for instance, tropes like we were talking about in terms of whether Diane as director was going to be in the role of the caretaker or the mammy, or she's going to, scold and whip us or something like that. But the way that these tropes perpetuated in the various events, large group and small group, and IE, as opposed to the invitation to explore beyond that.
Then what we had is that it was kind of curious to us that when given the opportunity, the membership could explore how it is that they were forming their own groups. But yet what happened instead was there was an absence of reflection, or sort of a fleeing from that moment. And what we believe is that the presence of the boundary fluidity that we saw throughout meant that there were aspects of being in the face of Black authority that could not be contained. It was as if the ideas of gender fluidity, non-binary sexual orientation and identity could be things that were available as conversation, especially given that the majority of the staff was not just Black, but also Black and female, meant that there was a different way that this was being held. But what we could not hold was the youngest member. And what we also could not hold was the member who represented the contagion that we now all face.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll do this quickly and then move to close the segment.
Okay, so what we now are beginning to think about is this construct that we want to present to you of not just the trauma of the moment, which a lot of language has been used around this, a collective trauma of the pandemic, but we think that there's uniquely something about the experience of Black folks when they're in positions of authority that we would want you to consider. And that has 4 elements, and my colleagues will sort of amplify on these. These are my own personal experience of trauma, which I may be carrying with me, and often are disproportionately true for people who are Black. Then there's the collective trauma of the current moment that we all find ourselves in. Then there's also the historical or social historical elements that are carried through us, both in history and in terms of epigenesis. And then the vicarious traumas, such as the Ahmaud Arbery situation, where we are not the direct victims of that violence, but vicariously we experience it. And so I'll turn it over to my colleagues to amplify these elements. Candice with the post-traumatic slavery.
So, I'm so kind of filled with all the stuff we're talking about that I'm gonna have to like integrate some of the past slide with this slide. That there was the element of I had this reflection when you were talking that on some level it's perhaps that even a contamination of a sense that sort of differentiating and presenting various aspects of Black authority was some kind of contamination to Black authority as it lives in the mind and in the fantasy of the staff and the members and at a societal level. And when I link that with ideas about vicarious trauma, post-traumatic slave syndrome, which was coined by, I forget the woman, the psychologist's name, Joy, I have it later in the notes, but that there is this element of how do you continue to hold your authority, interact with the world when you are carrying these levels of ways that you are responding in a hypervigilant kind of orientation to the environment around you, because everything is triggering a kind of PTSD response. It also conjures, the vicarious element conjures this, I read an article about a woman who was trying to, whose father was in the hospital dying, and she was entering the hall and hearing him scream from the hallway because they didn't believe that he was experiencing enough pain to be given an increase in painkillers. So having all of those elements with you as you are interacting with the world, it's all intersecting together.
Thank you. So all of our work was accomplished together with our illustrious staff. Our administrative team, Candice Crawford-Zakian, Chiaro Fong Olivares, Beverly Malone on the large group team as the team lead, Patrick Jean-Pierre. I was in the large group as well. A small group team, starting with the team lead, Dr. Zachary Green, up to Laura Dorsey-Elson, who was also a mentor with Zachary, Janice Wagner, Christopher Hall, Elise Cole, and Amber Williams, who were both consultants in training and who are joining us to help us with moderation on this call, in part because of their youth and their tremendous skill and expertise. So a full integration to help those of us who are approaching middle age, are middle-aged, or whatever it is. So we wanted to share that with you and to thank them. I think most of them, with the exception of a few, are on this webinar today, but to have you both behold and see the full spectrum and diversity of the full staff, and then their names are here on the right. And I want to say, in my role as director of the conference and convener of this, to thank them for going on this great adventure with us. It was not easy, it was complicated, it was authentic, and it was a challenge in so many ways, but they were a tremendous group and are a tremendous group. And it was really awesome to work with them. So this picture was taken on the last day of the conference. As you know, people were packing up to fly back to DC and Boston and all over the world. And the conference ended on Sunday night. We took this picture. And then a week later, we began this whole journey of the coronavirus. And within weeks after that, we saw headlines that looked like this: the Black Plague. New Yorker, April 16th. African Americans struggle with disproportionate COVID death toll. The National Geographic had an amazing article, some of which I'll cite today in terms of statistics and charts. Business Insider, April 12th. Black people account for 72% of COVID-19 deaths in Chicago. The quarantine became known as the white-collar quarantine, which not only touched on issues of race, but issues of class. So we saw a really wonderful article in the New York Times, and Chicago Tribune had a similar article as well. White-collar quarantine over virus spotlights class divide in the United States. It doesn't say that, but that's where it's focused. Washington Post, May 6th, disproportionately Black counties in US account for more than 50% of cases and nearly 60% of deaths, study shows. And that was a May 6th Washington Post article. Racial toll of virus grows even starker as more data emerges, Associated Press, April 18th. And so what I've done for you here is taken some of the data cited in these articles to talk about the ways in which there's been a disproportionate impact on African Americans in the United States in terms of their experience with COVID-19 and our experience. So the green bar throughout this chart focuses on the proportion of African Americans in state population, and the orange bar focuses on proportion of COVID-19 victims who are African American. And so in the District of Columbia, formerly known as Chocolate City, has currently, and this is based on the last census, 46.4% of that population are African American, yet 81% of the COVID cases are African Americans. It's almost twice the number there. In Mississippi, we're seeing something similar. A little more than a third of the population are African American, yet closer to 2/3 of that population in terms of the cases are affected. In Georgia, where Atlanta is a major center for the Black population, about 32.4% are African American, and a little more than half of the cases are affected are African American. And then I'll just cite Louisiana and maybe one more. This is where New Orleans is a hotbed for this disease right now. About a third of the population, 32.7% of the state of Louisiana population is African American, and a little more than half of those cases are African American affected by COVID. And then in Illinois, I'll skip to that. That's in the top 6 or 7 of the cases. This is also where Chicago is another hotbed, and where there have been, more than 70% of the deaths have been African American. 14% are African American in Illinois, yet 41% of the cases, or those affected by the disease, are African American. In terms of deaths, we see a very similar trend, again, starting with the District of Columbia. Up to mid-April, there were 80 deaths, I'm sure there are more, and 75% of those cases were African American. And if you look across, you'll see similarly what the percentage is of the population. They're about 45, 46% African American, yet close to 80% of the cases. So it's twice as many deaths as represented in the population. Mississippi, there have been 129 deaths, and the percentage of deaths are more than 2/3 of that number. Louisiana, where there's New Orleans, 524 of the 805 deaths were African American. And so it goes, and looking to the right, you'll see a similar thing. If you can see my pointer here, in Mississippi, the number of cases, the population is just a little, about 30+%, yet they represent 60+% of the deaths. So this came from the Associated Press mid-April. African Americans account for more than 1/3 of the COVID-19 deaths in the US, where the race of the victims has been publicly known. Now, what's important to note here is that not all patients self-identify, and not all Black people participate in the census. So this is but an estimate of what we think is actually lower than, we think it's actually greater than what's cited here. But these are the data sets that we have with which to work. And so we share those with you to continue to frame our conversation. So that's the data available to us, at least as it relates to cases and to deaths. We know from not only our own experience, but from psychology research and health-related and educational research, that Blacks experience disproportionate impacts and outcomes in other areas of their lives. So we're going to enter into that conversation, starting first with psychological. Zachary.
So from a psychological perspective, one of the things that we're concerned about is that we believe, as a hypothesis, that this trauma collectively then creates the conditions for unlocking primitive impulses. And as a consequence of that, there is an increase that we know of in domestic violence because of the stressors. But then when we move that out to a societal level, then who becomes the projective object of these experiences? And so the assault on the body being of Black people is represented in the consequences that are a function of structural inequality that lead to our experience of Black folks being more infected more often, and also the disproportionate death in many urban cities. In addition to that, we also believe that what happens is that there is a literal aspect of this in terms of the kind of assault that we alluded to on Ahmaud Arbery, that any time that there is a situation of stress in the system, then there's a projective field that is needed. And psychologically, we believe that this disproportionately influences the experience of Black people.
So another element linked to that, I want to talk about the physiological component and this narrative that emerged as we started to see this data come that Black people were being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. A part of a narrative that this was the consequence of poor life choices. And contrary to that, I mean, many of you may be familiar with a different narrative, which is related to how the impact of structural, cultural, and interpersonal racism actually leads people to, say, for instance, abuse substances or not eat as healthy as they could. That's even a different narrative that than what I think needs to be highlighted, that's really implicated in the health impact of this particular virus. And there's a growing body of research that shows that the body is directly impacted by experiences of racism, that there is direct bodily damage without an intermediary, such as a life choice, that it keeps the body in a fight-flight cycle, that it deteriorates the body's capacity to be able to fight off diseases, that it keeps the body in an inflamed kind of state for chronic diseases to emerge and permeate, that it increases the likelihood that a mother is going to have a child with low birth rate, or that the child is going to be impacted and not have as much internal regulatory capacity. And then this one last piece, there's an author, Shannon Sullivan, some of you might be familiar with her work. She wrote the book White Privilege, really goes in depth into the impact that racism has on the DNA strand, the chromosomes and DNA strands, that the telomeres, which I know a little bit of something about because my wife's mother is a molecular biologist, but the telomeres at the end, basically they start to fray, and this is an indicator of, I mean, everybody starts to fray, but it's an indicator of age. And when they look at the telomeres of Black women in comparison to white women, a Black woman between the age of 49 to 55 is an estimated biologically 7.5 years older than a white woman. So it's going straight into the body, straight into the molecular level without any intermediator, and impacting larger level health outcomes and making Black bodies more susceptible to both being infected with COVID and dying from COVID.
Right, and of course, what we have all been reading about is that this crisis has shone a light on inequities that existed pre-COVID and are now exacerbated exponentially, particularly with Black and Brown communities, poor communities. We certainly don't posit that what we're focusing on today, which is Black life, does not preclude or exclude, that is, other communities. And so in the Black communities across not only this country, but globally, there's all sorts of data that was already present about the structural and systemic inequities coming COVID-19 time. Suddenly, the resources that were already scant pre-COVID now, which were life dependent for our community, really we've got to see what the effects of when we're in an emergency like this is on Black communities. Things like, and we know the list, things like Black communities had although the unemployment rate was not all that high pre-COVID according to data, and we know that sometimes data is not always representative. Now we have 33 million Americans, and whatever the unemployment rate is with the overall country, it's going to be double, if not triple, for Black communities as it was pre-COVID. Access to health insurance, the ability to, or connectivity to the internet, the affordability, wired, whole neighborhoods in poor, which then equates to Black communities, brown communities, were not wired prior. So now we moved into a line where a way of life where being connected earns you a living. And suddenly all of this begins to really impact Black communities specifically. I live in the state of Maryland in the educational space. When we think about our public school systems and the data that shows that most Black children, most of our public schools are going to be popular with Black and brown and poorer students, depending on the neighborhoods, of course, depending on where they are. But here I live in the state of Maryland. It's just right in my personal world. And just about a month into when we had students now doing remote and distance learning, as school systems began to learn who was participating, who was not, it came to be that close to 3,000 plus students in the city of Baltimore alone were just not attending. And this was because of issues that preceded COVID around access to good quality education. And then now they couldn't even get the access because of interconnectivity. And that is tragic. Finally, commenting on the educational world, as I mentioned in my introduction, I work at Morgan State University in the city of Baltimore. Much of our student population comes from the city of Baltimore, Prince George's County. Although we are a global school, the predominance of our students come from these pockets in the state of Maryland, which I can speak to very specifically. And so I had lived experience of some of the impact of the inequities that existed before, flowing into our need to move online. I was teaching students that were attending class in the dark. I was teaching students that were living in spaces that did not have enough resources so that they were using devices like phones to do entire projects. And they made it. And there's the heroism of it was incredible. The tragedy that they had to rise above to this occasion in the middle of a time when privileges like none of us ever anticipated were not even in their midst. So on the note of historically Black colleges, university, of course, this leads us to the reality that these are the institutions that are going to be across all of the landscape of institutions across the world. HBCUs, what we call them historically Black colleges and universities. There are recent reports just as early as last week brought to us by our colleague Amber Williams to mention in this presentation, thank you Amber, that the pandemic does threaten the future of Black colleges and universities in a very unique way. These are universities that are often struggling financially, often leaning on the help of federal government. And so we're going to see, and we're already seeing, some of our smaller Black colleges begin to consider shuttering, which is tragic on a whole other level. This is not the case for Morgan State, by the way, but we are facing some tough economic decisions there as well. And this is just the beginning of listing what's up for us.
Thank you all. So we're going to be transitioning to next steps for America and next steps for us. So in the next 10 or so minutes, we look forward to opening the conversation with you all who are joining us, the 114 of you. Thank you. So as all of this is happening with us and thinking about Black authority and Black experiences and lives, there is an ongoing conversation more recently in the last week to two about what it means to reopen America. And we're not seeing or hearing any unitary perspectives here. In fact, there's been quite a bit of tension and complexity around these decisions. And some of the components of those decisions are, well, if we remain closed, so this is barbershops and even schools, salons, supermarkets, liquor stores, et cetera, in all different kinds of places, if we remain closed, we will lose our livelihood, the economy will crash, we will go down the tubes. And there's also, as a part of that tension, public health experts saying, hold on, we're going too quickly here, lives are at stake. And so, you know, you have economic, financial concerns, there are concerns around community well-being, concerns around public health and medicine. And what we're seeing is both leadership in crisis, like what do we do, not sure where to go, and leadership crises. What kinds of decisions should or can leaders be making at this time? And how can they do that while still maintaining relationship, loyalty, and trustworthiness, and that sense of confidence with their constituents? And what has emerged in this process are a number of protests and debates around what we should do. Some of those have occurred at the city level, the local level, the federal level. What we have seen, though, is what I believe will emerge as an iconic photo in US history. Michigan. And so a few weeks ago, this was seen in newscasts all over the country and all over the world as people who were armed coming in the Michigan State Capitol, confronting Michigan State Police. You see MSP there in masks while they are unmasked, challenging the decision of the governor to maintain stay at home and stay in place or shelter in place orders. Again, Michigan. And we've seen this also in Florida, we've seen this in California, we've seen this in other parts of the country. So this is not unique to this state, but it is a representative of some of the debates and the actions and the responses or reactions to this question about the role of government in our movement and in our freedoms. While that is happening, both in the fore and the background, we continue as Black people to have in our foreground that the projection is that Black Americans could bear the brunt of the fatal fallout if the US reopens the economy too soon. Black leaders are saying this is an attack. If Georgia is open too soon, this was April 24th, this will be considered an attack on people of color. The previous article that I shared remains the same, that in Chicago and places like Detroit and in other communities, Blacks will constitute and are constituting more than 2/3 of the deaths. As Georgia reopens, virus study shows that Black residents may bear the brunt, and this is New York Times, April 20th. The racial toll of virus grows even starker as more data emerges. I cited this one earlier as well. So that continues for us in the foreground as these debates continue, and most often I'm not seeing any of us represented in these photos and in this action to be eager to reopen America, so to speak. So this brings us to a set of questions and continuing our development of our hypotheses around what this means and how we can, from a psychodynamic and systems perspective, not only make sense of, but engage these debates, these thoughts, and influence those of us who teach and those of us who write and work in communities and other spaces, how we might use our understanding of psychodynamics and systems, not only for wayfinding and sense making, but for leadership. Colleagues?
One of the things that we want to continue on is this notion of Black aggression and the way that that turned into policies in this country in terms of specifically the notion of mass incarceration. And what we know from the virus is that there are many places, and an article just came out today in California, where because of mass incarceration, the COVID rates in prisons are dramatically increasing. And therefore, once again, it's an assault on Black bodies. So we believe that there is something about this unconscious, and I would dare say complicit perpetuation of these kinds of dynamics, which are in contrast to what we also know in terms of the kinds of placements and roles that Black Americans have, which Diane will allude to a little bit later.
Right. So from a psychodynamic and systems standpoint, I have been thinking about these folks. I mean, we're watching the news at night, and some stories are getting highlighted, sort of frontline workers, if you will. That's what we're calling them. But there's sort of a repetitive narrative, very similar to what we identified in the conference around sort of, I'm calling it a bit of a Black savior role that has led to the death of frontline healthcare workers, who are, one most recent was in Brooklyn, New York, a pillar of the community there in Brooklyn, and went in day after day only to contract, worked exhausting hours. And he himself, this doctor, was at health risk. I believe he was a bit heavy and maybe had some other underlying health issues that made him more susceptible to COVID-19. That's one. So the projections around self-care for Black people, that's another webinar. So then in comes this doctor stepping into all the projections of take the bullets first, take the hits first, go into the hospital. And this doctor did his job and died because of, sadly, contracted the virus. And now there's all of this lauding of the heroism of this doctor. And something about it is not right in my mind. It feels linked to the Black body in place, standing in place, and in this case, resulting in death. The other noticing I've had is around the authorization for Black people to know when they're ill and may need medical attention. Now, this has been studied prior to this crisis. What comes to mind is sort of, there's all sort of suspicion historically for Black people to, not trust white doctors. And there's data to suggest why. We think about Tuskegee Airmen, we think about the case at the Johns Hopkins Hospital right now the name escapes me, it's terrible when on the spot. Anyhow, but in this case, there was a story that really caught my attention of a African-American healthcare worker who knew that she was sick with COVID-19, authorized herself to go into her place of work to seek attention and was turned away. And in the face of needing life or death treatment, issues of authority and one's ability to know was questioned, and it was with a Black woman in her place of work. I've not heard other stories like this from other communities. And so this to me is about an interjection of an idea that she could not authorize. Thank you, Henrietta Lacks. Thank you, Ms. Wagner. So this is another way to look at this from a systems and psychoanalytic standpoint. What was projected and what was going on in her place of work that would not allow her own authority to come to the door ill and to be cared for. So these are some of the ways to think about this from a psychodynamic perspective.
Well, and linking with that, for me, when I think about it, it all links to a kind of broader, so the spectrum between Blackness and whiteness, and how on the end of whiteness, and whatever that represents, there's white people, there's Black people, and then there's whiteness, and then there's Blackness, and there's meaning imbued on the poles of the spectrum. And that whiteness represents a kind of desire for humanity, in my mind, to strip itself, to be sort of separated from our vulnerabilities, real human vulnerabilities in the world. And that Black bodies bear the brunt of articulating them, of experiencing them all the time, of being weighted with the consequences of a pandemic. And that the idea of a Black savior is because on this white end of the spectrum, where there's a fantasy of what's the word, invulnerability, of some of it is obviously systemically actually held in place. So we have the resources, and we have the money, and we have the distance, and I can be white and work at home, and white in terms of representation. those parts of me, I'm working from home, you know, that those frontline workers who are our saviors, those grocery store delivery people who are heroes, even though they actually don't have the choice of not working, of staying at home and still having some kind of income or paycheck, that they are bearing the brunt and the realities of the, for me at least, basic the human vulnerabilities. And there's a dehumanization that happens on both ends, but to an exceptionally exponential point the further down the spectrum of brown and black that you get.
Okay, just a time check for us and for the participants. If we can be brief on this one, we are going to talk now about the meaning and implications for group relations practice and group relations institutions and beyond. And I'll talk about recovery, reimagination, and rebuilding in a few minutes and turn it over to questions.
So I just want to touch on this briefly because this is a longer and larger conversation for those of us who are in group relations. So the need for a Black Authority Conference is then questioned when the Leicester Conference, the mecca, if you will, of the Group Relations Conference, is now directed by an African-American, well, African descent male, Leslie Brissett. And then Candice Crawford-Zakian is the director of the Boston Residential Conference. And then there's some question about what will go on with the ACRI conference as well. And so the placement of Black authority in these roles then would suggest that the need for the exact exploration that we are doing is no longer needed. But I think it is also a part of the fantasy of post-racial America that happened during the Obama administration. So that's a longer conversation. I have much more to say, but we'll leave it there for right now.
Great, thank you.
In the group relations world, and I'll keep it brief, I take that, there's been a number of coexisting explorations of Black authority, right? So I represent a line of it. I'm also a student of Howard University. We were studying it there back in 1995. It was incredible. And then from there, I went off to Morgan State University with my husband, Dr. Dorsey-Elson, and we partnered with Dr. John Bell Johnson and Dr. Kimberly Turner to create a conference series at Morgan State to study issues of empowerment, authority, and recognition among predominantly, if not all, Black groups. And so in the group relations world, this has been a conversation over a long number of years. I was a member at the first authority of Black Authority Conference directed by Dr. Green, and now am re-entering this part of it. But the idea of these coexisting and tributaries has been in the group relations world and manifesting in different ways. And some of us have mentored each other on this panel. Some of it, it's sort of, and so that's a part of the group relations story around the study of Black authority that I would like to bring.
The only thing I'll add right quick is that I'm only the second Black director of the Boston Residential Conference, second Black woman to Kathy White. So what that means, what that says in the midst of this conversation.
Mm-hmm. And then beyond group relations, since in part I hold some of the higher ed components, I pay attention to all these kinds of questions around who's leading our institutions. And in the one could call this the Obama effect or what's happening in the post-Obama era. But in the last year to 2 years, the predominantly white institutions have appointed Black people as their presidents, including, I'll just name a few, George Mason University recently named their first Black president in over 150-year history. The new president of University of Maryland, College Park, is also African-American. And I've also seen appointments less junior to those, if you will, of Emory and of other institutions in Pennsylvania and other Midwest as well, naming their first Black woman dean in business or in corporate settings. And so I'm paying more attention to that to see what the implications will be and also what the nature and the characteristics of those institutions might be as a result of those changes. And will this signal another post-racial calling or post-racial discourse, but I think the pandemic is actually going to prove us wrong on that. So finally, I just wanted to recommend to you all this reading. It's McKinsey put out a series last month, and I really appreciated their ideas around investing in Black lives and livelihood. And the thinking here, and I won't go through all the main points because of time, the thinking is around recovery, rebuilding, and reimagination. And they encourage researchers, stakeholders to focus on and to gather data on the racial disparities as impacted by COVID-19. And for employers and those of us in workspaces where we have that level of influence, to think about programs that will help with job matching, reskilling, cross-training, as well as an equity-minded approach to layoffs or downsizing or furloughs, and seeing first, and equity really thinks about where the barriers are to full standing, if you will, any structural barriers or any others, and if we're in positions to remove those and to address those, to do so. Then also economically, where we spend our money. And so they recommend supporting programs directly, both in kind forms of liquidity, where we make our contributions. Many of us aren't commuting right now, don't have expenses for gas, although we have other kinds of expenses, and suggesting that we sponsor organizations that advance the community and advance those most affected, particularly Black Americans. There's also a unique role for community and faith-based organizations to help to organize workers, to help with PPEs, to raise awareness in certain areas, also to offer wraparound support, just overall social support or economic, spiritual support for members in our communities who are suffering, particularly Black and brown people who are having unique challenges. And so for us, COVID has had, from our perspective, an outsized impact on the Black community. And we've seen that in the disparities that we talked about here. Investments in public health, digital infrastructure, public education, all of these recommendations have been made. We believe that for us as scholar activists and practitioners in group relations and other integrative approaches, that we need to look even more deeply and examine with greater sense-making and greater intention the implications around Black authority, Black life, and representation to inform actions that will create sustainable change and leadership in our communities and the world. On behalf of my colleagues and friends, Dr. Zachary Green, Dr. Laura Dorsey-Elson, and Dr. Candice Crawford-Zakian, thank you.